My name is Marad Irfan, and today I'll be discussing the effects of South Asian parental influence on career choice. Principally, it's important to understand the background and the actual immigration patterns of South Asians that brought them to the Western nations like Canada and the United States before discussing the effects that they have on their children. Let's discuss that immigration. In the mid to late 1900s, the South Asian American Digital Archive reported that mass migration to the West, specifically to the United States and Canada, skyrocketed. Punjabi Sikhs came to Canada looking for jobs in railroads, farms, and other areas that offered small, quick labor. However, they actually yearned for something more: a quality education, highly lucrative careers, and being able to one day raise their own families and raise their own children to be successful in Western nations while still holding on to their culture. When South Asians pictured themselves starting families, they pictured their children growing up and pursuing a strong education. An anecdote from a paper written by Ashwini Auberjohn talks about an Indian girl named Amy Chua, who in 9th grade, when she wrote papers about their future careers, she said that she wanted to become a brain surgeon just because her parents told her to. But what she actually wanted to do was secretly become a writer. Just like this, I also suffer the same parental influence from my mother as well. She has often pressured me to look into careers specifically in healthcare, and even if it does not align with my ambitions. That's what really inspired me to look into this study. But now, let's look at the literature review. My literature review is organized around 3 key themes. First, I'll explore different parenting styles. Second, I'll examine why our parents feel so compelled to influence their children. And finally, I'll look at the effects of the parental influence and how South Asian children respond to them. Theme 1, parenting styles. Scarlett Wing explores the broader concept of parental influence by referencing the tiger mom style. This parenting style is strict and harsh, and it's often controversial as it emphasizes discipline, high academic standards, and minimum room for self-expression. Wang's work overall sets the stage for understanding how culture can impact children's autonomy, but this was only seen for East Asian families in the study. However, a study by Rahman and Mazunder parallels to the idea of the Chinese tiger mom, but in a South Asian cultural setting. They show that the parental style isn't just about being strict, but by South Asian parents, they found that it's seen as a necessary sacrifice. In their interviews with South Asian parents, many believe that their harshness now in their parental influence would lead to success later in competitive academic environments. They also introduce an idea called fear of comfort. In many South Asian households, they believe that too much comfort is to breed laziness and will eventually lead to them not being successful in their academics. This harsh love sometimes comes out of love, fear, and because of the own sacrifices that the parents made. Across both of these studies, we see a consistent image of South Asian parenting emerging: high control, academic pressure, and a minimum tolerance for failure. Overall, through the parenting styles examined in this portion of the literature review, parental influence is often presented as hostile and aggressive. This helps sets the stage to see why South Asian parents may participate in influencing their children to go towards certain career paths. They often do this to even for family honor in their local South Asian communities. When people make decisions on entering a certain career or pursuing an education at a certain university, these decisions are not really seen as private and are most of the time seen as public. So their parenting styles also care about the child, but they also want to make sure that their family looks presentable in a social setting. The second theme is the reasons for parental influence. The most foundational reason is the desire for a better life for their children. Many South Asian immigrants, especially first generation, report being raised in nations where there was lots of poverty, trauma, and stress. However, they still left around their family and their status, and they see their strict way of raising their children as a way to protect their kids from similar instabilities. Shamal Al-Yunus adds emotional depth to this reasoning as she explores how this influence often stems from intergenerational hope. This study was about Bangladeshi Muslim women who were raising their Muslim daughters in America, and they wanted their children to fulfill the dreams that their parents were never able to chase. Most of them were not able to hold a job as they weren't able to gain an education before rushing to America for their children. This is especially common in families that experience trauma, war, and displacement. Next, Hack et al. Emphasizes how financial success is often a main priority as well. In this study, parents repeatedly described high-income careers like medicine, engineering, and finance as not just ideal, but necessary. Instead of looking at the ambitions of the child, they like to focus on what's going to set my child up to be the most financially successful in their life. These jobs are often seen as the clearest path to not only financial security, but again, a sense of social prestige in their local communities. However, interestingly, Hack also notes that as household income rises, parental influence actually intensifies. Middle and upper class families often raise their expectations because they fear the same thing that was seen in Rahman and Mazunder's study, which is a fear of comfort. They want their children to continue pushing for elite universities and prestigious careers, even though they have this financial stability through their parents. This pressure is framed around a strong work ethic and the belief that success is actually earned and not just given through family. Mader and George then shift the conversation to the actual culture, especially the difference between collectivist and individualistic parenting. This study presents South Asian parenting styles as two different types. Collectivism, which is the idea that a child's success reflects on the entire family's image. Again, this means that career decisions are not seen as private, but actually generational. They also discuss how some parents recognize that Western norms like encouraging independence, but they still like to hold on to firm traditional values to make sure their children don't flow astray. Many believe that even if it causes a short-term sense of tension or even dissension between the child and the parents, they don't mind because they believe that they're doing what's best for their children. They believe that their stressful guidance will eventually lead to long-term stability. All three of these studies, Hack, Mader, and Al-Yunus, point to different motivations behind South Asian parental influence. But overall, they cite financial security as a top priority while often adding an emotional layer at the bottom. This goes on to show that the reasons for these influences are overall to drive children to be successful. This style of parenting is referred to as protective parenting, and South Asian parents don't mind if the parenting style might cause some short-term tension because it's what's best for their success. The third theme looks at the effects of the parental influence. In a study by Jamie Workman, they explore how parental assistance impacted student outcomes while choosing majors in college. What's unique about this research is its emphasis on the supportive side of influence. However, most of the time in the study, the parental assistance that students faced often caused stress and anxiety. However, Jamie Workman reports that when the parental influence is served as a sense of guidance, students actually do better and they're able to make decisions on their own. This contrasts sharply with the idea of the Chinese tiger mom model that we saw earlier and shows that when the influence is used right, it actually allows the student to be more confident in their decisions. Essentially, the style and the tone of the parental influence matters. However, Rasool et al. In 2020 use a more data-driven perspective. They conducted an exploratory factor analysis on students from Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani communities on the East Coast. Their goal was to understand how different types of parental involvement affected academic and emotional outcomes. Their results revealed that this involvement often correlated positively with academic performance, especially when parents were engaged but not overbearing in making their children feel stressed. Students reported higher self-discipline, stronger academic goals, and a clearer sense of identity. The biggest takeaway from this study is that when parental influence is used right, it's actually extremely helpful for the child and they overall perform better in school. Rasool also notes that a highly directive and excessive parental influence could eventually backfire, causing anxiety and resentment between the child and the parent. Overall, the effects of parental influence prove to be different based on how it's given. However, the literature poses it to be tense most of the time and causing a sense of dissension between the family. This all brings me to my gap. While existing research does offer valuable insights about parental influence, there's a lack of actually looking at the generational context. Most of these studies focus on East Coast immigrant communities, like the ones by Rasool and Hawk. However, South Asians in the Southwest and West Coast were not explicitly shown in these studies, including areas like Arizona, that may have different experiences shaped by less dense cultural communities and different socioeconomic conditions. Additionally, while much of the literature focuses on parental expectations, there's less of an exploration on how the effects of migration from their home nations to the West might affect their style of parental influence. My research addresses this gap by focusing on how the culture shapes the parental influence while keeping their immigration in mind. This has led me to the following research questions, which is how does parental influence affect career choice in South Asian communities, and what are the reasons for such parental influence? To answer this question, I used a quantitative survey to explore how South Asian parental influence affected career decision making. This survey was built using a Likert scale, which is widely recognized for measuring the intensity of attitudes and perceptions. In a study by Hamed Dahrdous, they found for Likert surveys to be simple and highly reliable, and to be a good way of collecting data from a big group. Scholars like Jamie Workman and Shamal Yunus also used mixed methods that did have Likert scale surveys in them as well. I distributed the survey to 3 key groups: people who are in high school, college students, and people who have already entered the workforce. These categories were able to let me take a look at the different types of parental influence throughout these different stages, from early aspirations to more concrete career decisions. To ensure a diverse sample, I shared the survey through the ISSU, or the Indian Subcontinental Student Union, at my school, because that had students of many different South Asian nations in that club to ensure a diverse participants. The survey ended up focusing on 3 main areas: perceptions of parental influence, career goals and current paths, and the emotional responses to the parental involvement. Now, onto the results. One of my main findings was that almost 50% of participants strongly believe that their parents have an influence over their career choice. And also, I've turned a study by Forbes, which asked a general population, into a pie chart to be better seen, and it showed that only 40% of students were influenced by their parents, which shows that South Asian parental influence might be stronger in helping students choose a career choice. This is fascinating because we can see that South Asian parental influence might be more intense. Additionally, in this slide, we can see 2 different graphs, and for the one on the left, we see that almost 57% of students were satisfied with the parental influence that they are receiving, so we can infer that they judge this to be more supportive than hostile or intense. And then on the slide here, we see, do you believe your parents' cultural or social values play a role? And they also said yes to that, showing that the cultural roots of how they were raised and also their immigration might play a role on how they raise their children. And for a review of the research question, how does parental influence affect career choice in South Asian communities? This led me to 3 main findings. First is that parental expectations heavily influence career choices. One of the strongest findings of these studies was the overwhelming influence that South Asian parents have on their children's career decisions. It showed that almost 61.4% of respondents reported being pressured to explore or research a particular career path due to the expectations, and 50% of participants stated that their parents actively influence their career choices in some form. These numbers suggest that the parental input is not just present, but it's deeply embedded in every single decision along the way. And that was also seen because the Likert scale survey was given to all 3 groups to see how those changes happen over time. This supports previous research as influence, no matter how direct, does play a role. My second finding was that children are generally satisfied with the parental influence that they receive. This was contrary to much previous literature like Jamie Workman's findings. They described parental involvement as a source of stress and anxiety. However, my study revealed a far more positive relationship compared to theirs, with almost 93.2% of respondents saying that they feel supported by their parents while making decisions regarding their career goals. This is striking because in the literature review, we saw that it actually caused stress, but in my study, almost 9 in 10 participants report feeling a sense of emotional support and guidance. Next, the final finding was that cultural roots actually deepen the influence, and this refers to the cultural foundation of the parents. Past studies such as Shamal Yunus's research on Bangladeshi Muslim mothers pointed to traditional values as a shaping force in parenting. And my study confirms this, as the cultural transmission doesn't really only apply to Bangladeshi Muslim communities, but it applies to these South Asian communities as a whole, as we can see in the survey. Almost 82% of respondents said that their parents' cultural background plays a significant role in how they guide their children's career choices. So it's not simply based on personal opinion or individual parenting style, but it's rooted in their cultural norms, and their immigration may have had an effect on that as well. First we're going to look at the answer to those research questions, which is, does parental influence affect career choice in South Asian communities? Yes, through the pressure to look into certain career choices and the cultural pressures for certain fields, like shown in the literature review, where they talked about how careers like engineering, finance, and medicine were often prioritized and seen as necessary. And then how does that influence work and where does it come from? Like the third finding showed on the last slide, the culture plays a huge role in this influence, and this aligns with the study that talked about Bangladeshi mothers, but now it can be generalized to South Asian parents as a whole, instead of just Bangladeshi Muslim mothers. However, there also were some limitations to the study as well, And first, it's important to know that there was a gender imbalance in my study. Almost 72% of participants were male, while only 27% were female, meaning that it can't really be easy to generalize this study to both groups, especially because in South Asian culture, expectations can differ based on gender between the two, so it's not easy to make those assumptions. Next, my survey almost only had 50 respondents, which is usually small for a survey. However, I believe that since I was only looking for South Asian students, 50 is still a decently impressive amount, as the lack of South Asian students on my campus made it hard to find responses. Finally, not all South Asian nations and cultures were represented in my study. No people from Bhutan, Nepal, or Sri Lanka were actually included in the study, making it hard to generalize this parental influence to those populations as well. So, for a review of the key points, parental influence plays a huge role in career choice. Many students feel pressure or guidance from their parents when choosing a career path. Next, second and more surprisingly, is that South Asian students are actually satisfied with their parental influence, which was contradictory to what we saw in the literature review. Past research framed it as hostile and that parental involvement was overbearing, but my study showed that over 9 in 10 people believed that they felt supported by their parents instead of burdened. And third again was that South Asian culture does deepen this influence, and it plays a huge role in how parents raise their children. That said, there are still many future opportunities for research. A way that we could look at it was between first and second generation people, possibly students after receiving parental influence from their parents who directly came from those nations. They might decide to be more lenient with their children based on the parental influence they received, or they could even adopt the same parenting styles because it worked out for them and they were ending up being successful. Another way to look at this would be looking at subcultural variations. Maybe the South Asian parental influence doesn't apply to South Asian communities as a whole, and there could possibly be an opportunity to look at specific nations like only Pakistani parents or only Indian parents. Finally, a longitudinal study could be a good future research opportunity, tracing parental influence all the way from someone in middle school or high school all the way to them going into the workforce. It could be nice to look at how parental influence changes the decisions they make along the way. Overall, my research sheds light on how strong and sometimes positive and negative that South Asian parental influence can be, and it still opens the door for many more future research opportunities. That's what I'm saying.
Terrific job. This was really impressive.
Thank you.
Okay, got a couple of questions for you. So first, how did your review of the methods that were used by all of the literature that you read, how did that influence your ability to select a method that aligned with your process?
Yeah, I'd say the literature that I looked at definitely did have an influence on the method that I chose. Specifically, the study by Jamie Workman used a mixed method with both interviews and a Likert scale survey. And also the study that I looked at, which showed that Likert scales were reliable, by Hamed Darhadus, those both kind of influenced me to choose a Likert scale survey and use it to collect my data.
What are the real-world implications or consequences related to these findings?
Some real-world implications are that we finally have a perspective on how South Asian parental influence actually works in areas like the Southwest. Most of the literature that I looked at before and like the articles I read focused on South Asian parental influence mostly on the East Coast. So a consequence of this is that we can finally see some real results in data about how that parental influence works in a place like Arizona.
Alrighty. So what was the most important research skill you developed as a result of this process, and how might you apply that in the future?
I'd say the most important skill I learned in this process was reading scholarly work and like peer-reviewed journals. Just my creation of the literature review allowed me to read those sources deeply, and I feel like that's something really important, especially for when I go to college. I'll be reading peer-reviewed journals almost every day, depending on what I study. And even in the workforce, just knowing how to read scholarly work is something that I learned from this, and I'll definitely be using in my future.